Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video we're looking at Henry VIII and we're looking at a key question on this Tudor unit on how did English society change and with what effects in relation to the reign of Henry VIII. And we're going to look at a number of different aspects in this and hopefully give you some really helpful information and a bit of evaluation to help you with your studies. So the key question, this is related to one of the six key questions, is how did English society and economy change and with what effects? So there's two bullet points in the AQA spec that relate to this. There is society, elites and commoners, regional issues and the social impact of religious upheaval and rebellion. And then there's the second one that is economic development, trade, exploration, prosperity and the depression. I'm going to concentrate on the first one of those. Today we're going to look at society, we're going to look at different parts of society, we're going to look at some of the regional issues, and we're going to look at rebellion and the problems caused by the religious changes. The nobility are the top of the elite. They are the level just below the king, and the nobility had been a real kind of issue, a real problem for Henry VII, and therefore his relationship with them had not been great, as he'd come to deal with these overmighty subjects that he'd essentially had to reign over when he won the crown at the Battle of Bosworth. For Henry VIII, things are a little bit different. His father had done most of the hard work for him in terms of subduing the power of the nobility and raising the power of the crown. And Henry notably did things like got rid of the council learned in the law, and he executed Epsom and Dudley right at the beginning of his reign. And generally a lot of the nobility were his friends, and we'll see this reflected in what I'm about to talk about in a minute. Now the nobility continued to do their traditional roles, providing armies. For example, the Earl of Shrewsbury produced a large number of men in 1513 for Henry's campaign in France, and they maintained the control in the locality, and so they had a really important regional role as well. And they were the court, the main people at court. And many served in the council, and so the nobility are important, and the relationship is a bit better with Henry VIII than it was with Henry VII. The nobility grew by a grand total of 9 during the reign of Henry VIII, so he grew a little bit, but not ginormously, partly because although new members of the nobility were added, there was also noble families that died out, and there were also some acts of attainder and some nobility that are removed. Notable promotions tended to be due to a very close relationship with the king. So, for example, his brother-in-law Edward Seymour was elevated to the earldom of Hertfordshire, and then later on obviously became the Duke of Somerset during the reign of Edward himself. So we can see here him promoting those around him. The Duke of Norfolk is restored to the title, which had been enjoyed by his father. He was a key figure at court, leading figure in the Conservative faction, uncle of Catherine Howard. Actually ends Henry's reign in prison and very narrowly escapes execution. But in the reign of Henry himself, it was a very important figure. The Duke of Suffolk was promoted largely just to being one of Henry's best mates, and this aroused some criticism, notably from Erasmus, in terms of Henry doesn't really seem to ennobling people necessarily, looking at figures in terms of merit. I mean, one exception to that might be Cromwell. Lord Cromwell, we see Cromwell being ennobled, promoted due to merit. Again, not something that was hugely popular, and obviously Cromwell doesn't outlive Henry, and he is executed in 1540. Any nobility who crossed Henry, as some of the stuff I've hinted at already with Norfolk and Cromwell, or were seen as a threat, were dealt with very harshly. The Duke of Buckingham, who was the only Duke in 1509, was executed for treason on some of the most vaguest charges in 1521. The King's relatives, Henry Pole, who was Baron Montague, and Henry Courtenay, who was a Marquess of Exeter, were accused of treasonable conspiracy and executed in 1538. Again, they were considered to be a threat to the succession by Henry, so he removed them. So the nobility continued to be brought under more control of the monarch, and again we see a bit more assertion of royal authority. An example of this is Baron Thomas Fines, who was a baron, and he was hanged as a common criminal for murdering one of his neighbour's servants. And it's very difficult to envision that kind of thing happening at the start of the Tudor period or before the Tudor period. So maybe we really are starting to see a bit of a decline in the power of the nobility during the reign of the Tudors, and the monarchy really establishing itself as being really preeminent over the nobility, and not willing to put up with any potential problems. Now, another member of the elite are the gentry. Now, gentry comes from the term gentleman. It's not the most precise term. It lacks a kind of a legal justification. It's not like you can see someone who's ennobled because they're lord something, or baron, or marquis, or something like that. But it's slightly more tricky with the gentry. They often acquired this idea of gentility as a result of office or professions or business, and they grew in number, they grew in wealth, and they grew in importance during the reign of Henry VIII. They benefited hugely from the sale of monastic lands, particularly when it's been sold relatively cheap right towards the end of Henry's reign, as he's trying to raise more money, mainly to fight the French. And in the fact that you had an increasingly bureaucratic systems and an extent of a kind of meritocratic nation, not completely, but some meritocratic nature in some elements of local and national government. And a desire really from Henry to prevent the nobility from holding too much power, and all this stuff kind of sort of helped the rise of the gentry. And in terms of societal change, the rise of the gentry, I think, is really one of the key stories of Henry VIII's reign, if not the key story of Henry VIII's reign. It's difficult to give a precise number of the number of the gentry during his reign, and a guy who knows a huge lot more about this than I do is John Guy, and he suggests there was about 5,000 gentry families in 1540. There was an increased number of justices of the peace, and this increased those who participate in local administration again, and that is part of the story of the rise of the gentry. And they were then also drawn, as well as being GPs, who gentry were drawn into unpaid administrative roles on behalf of the crown, which raises their station, and it gives them expertise, and it gives them experience in a way that maybe this group or class hadn't had before, when everything was completely dominated by the aristocracy, by the nobility. The gentry were increasingly keen on their sons acquiring legal training, and that meant that they could better fulfil such roles and advance both locally and nationally. And a lot of the Crown's administration had previously done by clergymen, and increasing those jobs are taken by laymen instead, and the gentry are the people who were filling those roles, and those roles often generated income, and they'd bring about more land ownership, and that would help get people into the gentry status. So there was a degree here of social mobility, and again this is another issue, another example of social change in the reign of Henry VIII, as we start to see a couple of people really who paved the way in terms of social change. Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell really do show that social mobility is a possibility in the reign of Henry VIII, and people from fairly humble beginnings can rise up through education, through legal training, through merit. And so again, this is an element of societal change. Commoners, on the other hand, don't really see a huge amount of change. There are things that are changing around them and to them. So there are religious changes which are going to impact on them. We'll have a look at some of those. One of the big things that's happening to them is enclosure, which is denying them access to land, and it is causing them financial hardship, and is bringing about societal change because they have to go and find other things to do, and therefore we start to see the growth of some industries, and we start to see some urbanisation. But the actual lives of most commoners were pretty much unchanged from what had gone before. The vast majority of them had very few possessions, had very little chance of regular and secure employment. So in that, we don't, at the very bottom end, we don't see an enormous amount of societal change. That we do see some things happening to people and around people that is making them uncomfortable and therefore not liking the changes that they're seeing, be them religious or be them economic changes like enclosure. The other really big issue for the common people was the rise in the rate of inflation, and this led to drops in real income, and this starts to contribute to a kind of an ill feeling that many people felt on, for example, the imposition of the amicable grant, which we'll look at, and outbreaks of a disorder were not uncommon. So this is not necessarily a society that was wholly satisfied and wholly peaceful. So we see the real disruption, don't we, with the War of the Roses, and then we see Henry VII coming in and restoring order and the power of the monarchy. But it's not like everything is nice and smooth and sorted in the reign of Henry VIII. Now, some of this is really Henry's doing. With the inflation is partly bad because of his foreign wars, and obviously the religious changes is because of his divorce and split from Rome. But some of it is longer term. It's changes like enclosure and urbanization, and that is making some of the key kind of cornerstones of society and the kind of stability of society shift slightly, and that therefore we see a rise in disorder. There were regional issues. So, for example, we see changes in Wales with the Act of Union in 1536, and Wales is divided into shire counties. The shires are given representatives in the House of Commons, so we've got Welsh representatives in the House of Commons for the first time, and the same legal framework now exists in both Wales and England. And Wales has become largely, or has become incorporated into England at this point, and there's very little separating Wales from England apart from the survival in some places of the Welsh language. And Wales was largely controlled on behalf of the Crown. Edward was the Prince of Wales, as was tradition with the eldest son of the monarch. However, increasingly we see members of the aristocracy, such as the Earls of Pembroke, and members of the largely anglicised Welsh gentry, and the more English they became, the more likely they were to gain influence and power, and they controlled most of the politics within Wales, and they were the people who tended to get elected to Parliament and became kind of leading figures in the legal professions in Wales as well. So Wales is undergoing some change. The other area where there is major regional issues is in the north. Now, the Act resuming liberties to the Crown in 1536 reduced the independence of the Prince Bishop of Durham, and this is kind of the last area of this type really that remains. The others have kind of gone under royal control, but the Prince Bishop of Durham remained is a kind of degree of independence. And the Palatinate Court of the Chancery continued to operate, so the power as Palatinate doesn't go away completely, but it is limited, and we see this as a process of Henry trying to take a tighter control over the outlying regions of his realm. So we've seen it in Wales, we see it in the north of England. The north of England did pose problems for the governance of the reign. It was further away from London. Issues are shown particularly with the huge number of supporters in Yorkshire with the further Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, and this led to Henry and Cromwell re-establishing a council in the north as a permanent body based in York with a professional staff. So we see an acknowledgement of Henry of the need for greater administration and control in the outlying regions, and that had both administrative and legal functions, and it showed its worth later on, keeping the north quiet in the reign of Edward in 1549, when we see 2 rebellions in one summer. Now, there is a real social impact of religious upheaval, and centre of this is the dissolution of the monasteries, because monasteries played a really important role in supporting the ordinary people in Tudor England, in particular the poor, the ill, the elderly. Monasteries also played a really important role in education, and so one of the big questions that's posed by this is where is that education going to come from? So this is then not only for the people very bottom society, but people slightly further up as well. And a lot of the monasteries, they produced a lot of goods, and they became a kind of centres of business in the local area, and in some places the monastery also doubled up as the parish church. So there was a great deal of unease, particularly amongst the common people, but across society at the dissolution of the monasteries. Now the sale of monastic land did benefit some people, most notably the gentry, and again, so this is one of the big societal changes that is taking place. Many were upset by other religious changes as well. For example, the removal of holy days, the stopping of pilgrimages, the worshipping of relics that were taken out, and a lot of these things have been very key events and key aspects of people's lives. And so if you change the people's lives, then you're going to get a reaction against it. And again, the people in society are not hugely happy with this change. Another big thing for society is suddenly there's a load of monks and nuns who are unemployed. Now, for the monks, some of them received pensions, some of them changed from monks and became priests and joined that aspect of the clergy. The position of nuns was very, very precarious. So this is, again, another part of society that is really affected by change under Henry VIII. So as I said, there is a rumbling discontent. There are things that people are unhappy about, and we do see some rebellions. In 1525, we have the amicable grant, and Wolsey is trying to find a way of raising money for Henry's foreign policy. It's not well received, and taxes often weren't. In 1513, there had been objections in Yorkshire to a subsidy, and because of the objections, that money kind of been written off by the Crown. They decided not to collect it because it was causing too many problems. Now, many people in England refused to pay this amicable grant in 1525, and it posed a really substantial issue. Largely because it's not concentrated, the opposition to this, in the normal areas, the outlying areas. It's actually fairly widespread, and the strongest resistance is in North Essex and south of Suffolk. The Earl of Essex reported a gathering of 1,000 on the Essex-Suffolk border, and they were determined to resist payment. The Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk faced a group of 4,000 taxation resistors, mainly made up of cloth workers who were unemployed and just couldn't afford to pay the taxes. So again, it looks like the monarchy is demanding too much. So this really shows that Henry can't operate in defiance of the tax-paying classes, and so his power is constrained by wider English society. And actually, when he next invaded France, he used money from the sale of monastic lands rather than going back and asking for something similar to the amicable grant. And it also showed there is a bubbling discontent, and when pushed, this level of discontent would rise up, and people would take that. Well, it's an enormous risk of taking up in protest. Even in groups of thousands, you still are running the risk of deeply unpleasant deaths. So it shows that everything is not socially and economically well, because the people are willing to take a stand on some of these issues. By far and away, the largest rebellion in the reign of Henry VIII is the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, and it has a whole range of motives behind it, on top of this idea that it's a kind of orchestrated attempt to attack Henry's position on religion, and therefore it's court-based, and it surrounds support for Mary. There are areas of kind of wider discontent spreading through the majority of society. So we see religious motives, and it can just be viewed in religious terms. So you have the dissolution of the monasteries, and religious beliefs and loyalties to the local institution cause much anger, in particularly in the north and in Lincolnshire. And by the autumn of 1536, the dissolution of the small monasteries were on the way, and that this was leading to a loss of charity, a loss of education, and a loss of parish provision in lots of places in England. The injunctions of 1536 were deeply unpopular. They were seen as an attack on traditional religious practices that were held dear, particularly in the north. Local traditions such as celebrating St Wilfrid's Day in Yorkshire was discouraged, as were pilgrimage, and all this is causing a real degree of upset. There were also rumours that the government were going to go further. In particular, Cromwell, who was very much seen as the man behind all of this. They thought they were going to confiscate all the church plate and the jewels, and there's people burying it and hiding it to make sure it can't be taken away, and essentially destroy the church as people knew it and loved it. And again, so we see an important part of society and how significant religion is, and how potentially dangerous for the Tudor monarchy any changes to religion were. There are also secular or non-religious motives for a lot of the people who got involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace. And part of this, it's linked to monastic land, but rather than it being a fear that this has been taken away and it's a religious issue, it's a fear that it's going to be taken away and it's going to be sold to southerners, and therefore this is going to drain wealth out of the north and it's going to see it seeping down to the south. A lot of the ordinary motives, the ordinary members were motivated by economic grievances, so things like taxation. There were grievances over tenancy and land ownership, and a lot of the rebellions in the Pennines and the Cumberland kind of related to this, and we've got things like enclosure lurking behind the scenes on this as well. We also see the Crown's attempt to impose the Duke of Suffolk as a great magnate is one of the sparks of the rebellion in Lincolnshire. So there's a whole wealth of reasons behind it, but all of this suggests, again, a society that is not fully content, is not fully loyal. And we also see that maybe some of these regions are not fully under royal control. Now, with the Pilgrimage of Grace, we end up with the Royal Army facing about 40,000 men at Doncaster. Now, there are concessions given. Henry decides to grant a general pardon and promised Parliament would consider the demands that are presented to his representatives. And the rebels at that point disperse, but there's another fresh rebellion in January, and with Henry saying that he's in a stronger position to deal with this, he acts very swiftly. He arrests and executes the rebel leaders, including Robert Askew, who'd previously been invited to the court for Christmas and treated to new clothes and all kinds of exciting things. And he was hanged at York, and this was a real sign that Henry gave to the people of the north of what happened if you defied him and went against him. But again, we are seeing the need here of fear to really impose the king's will, and again, suggestion that not always well in English society. And the episode as a whole really worried Henry. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that's given you some insight into English society during the reign of Henry VIII and some of the changes that took place, notably with the growth of the gentry, and also some of the problems bubbling under with religious changes and economic difficulties and things like inflation and enclosure. If you liked the video, then please hit the like button. If you've got anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to ask, then please hit us up in the comments. And if you want more like this on Tudors or other topics that you're studying or interested in, there's a whole range of different playlists. On this one, we are aiming to cover the whole of the A-level spec on the Tudors. And if you subscribe, then you'll get notifications as further videos get added. So thank you very much again for watching.